I'd like to welcome Dr. Richard Drass. For those of you who aren't familiar with Richard, Richard received his PhD from the University of Oklahoma in 1995. He is a research faculty emeritus at the Oklahoma Archeological Survey at the University of Oklahoma in Norman and has over 40 years of experience in Southern Plains archaeology. His research interests include paleoethnobotany, development of Plains village and protohistoric cultures and their subsistence patterns, and geophysics and settlement studies. Current research includes study of early Wichita villages and the construction of fortifications from 1500 to the 1800s. And on that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Drass.
Thank you, Drew. Today I want to talk about one of the main features at some of the Wichita villages that we know of, and there's been very little investigation of fortifications. The first fortification that we know of historically documented is at what's known as the longest site today. And it was the village attacked by the Spanish in 1759 in retribution for the attack of the Wichita and their allies on San Saba Mission. With this attack and later descriptions from visitors to the fort give us our first and only major really description of Wichita fortifications. And at the time, the Spanish were repelled relatively easily, and they justified this by suggesting that the fort was a French-led construction and was not a native fortification. They didn't believe that Wichita could build fortifications at that time. As we'll see, we now know that fortifications that occur at Wichita sites as far back as 1450 to 1500 AD and are a major part of Wichita features at sites, but they've been very little documented, and the ones that have been investigated haven't been discussed much in the literature. So we can go from our description of the longest site and go back in time and look at some of the earlier Wichita villages that have fortifications. And then I'm going to come back and deal with the longest site again in terms of what was described in the historic record. They do describe a stockade, a rampart and stockade, and we're surrounded by a ditch and an entryway that was stockaded that wound down to the river off the high terrace that the village sits on. So in this talk, we're going to move around a little bit, but I'll get back to the longest site eventually. I want to mention here that in 1967, aerial photographs of a deep plowed field at the longest site revealed a circular, or actually oval stain about 80 by 120 meters. And this was tested with two 5-foot squares, and it was identified as a ditch that was full of trash from the village. And a lot of the trash in it was bison bone, and you'll see in this image that the white ring in the outline is primarily bone showing up from the deep plowing of the bone out of the fortification ditch. In 1967, that was the only work that was done, and there was no other work done on the longest fort until 2013 when we went back and did some more excavations. But I want to go back in time a little bit and deal with earlier fortifications first and what we've seen in the Wichita sites. From Kansas and Oklahoma into Texas, we find evidence of fortifications at Wichita villages at various times. The earliest in the 15th or 16th centuries, and we have 3 of those. They're in the western part of Oklahoma, the 2 western sites here, WA2 and BK2, and then an unplowed and virtually uninvestigated site in the southern Texas panhandle that I'll mention briefly that needs a lot further work. The other sites on this map, including the ones in Kansas, northern Oklahoma, the longest site is JF1 on the Red River, and the site down there in 41 ML 38. These sites date to the 1700s or later, and we'll come back to those as I go through the talk. Right now, we want to go out to the western Oklahoma ones and deal with the earliest fortifications. 2 forts, Edwards 1 and Duncan sites, are within about 35 miles of each other. Edwards 1 is the earliest investigated after the longest site. It was dug in 1968. and they did discover a ditch full of bison bone and other trash. It dates in the 1450 to 1600 time period, as does Duncan's site. There's no evidence of European goods at this site and no horse bone, no indication of any European contact with these villages. What we do know is that Apache groups were moving into the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma in the 1400s. The ditches, the forts that were built at this time may be a reaction to conflict with Apache groups that were coming into the area, interrupting Wichita trade routes to the southwest and access to bison hunting grounds and various other aspects. I emphasize that as what may have led to fortifications, but it also appears that many of these two villages in western Oklahoma especially contain lots of trade material from the southwest, pottery, obsidian, all kinds of materials from New Mexico, and Caddo pottery and some other stuff from the southeast. So these Wichita groups were trading over long distances. It may be that the Apache became both traders and conflict and warriors in terms of what the Wichita do. So we believe that some of these sites may have functioned as trade centers that were allowed peaceful trade between Apache and Wichita groups. That still needs further investigation, but it makes sense in terms of western Oklahoma where these sites are and why the fortifications appear in this area at the earliest time period. The Edwards site's on the North Fork of the Red River, and it, I mentioned, was investigated in 1968. Excavations are on this map. Semicircular line is the fortification ditch. The field has been plowed so that we don't know where the ramparts were in terms of this excavation. But it's important to point out that there are features inside the fortifications. This particular fortification is on the east edge of the site of the terrace that overlooks the Red River, North Fork of the Red River. But most of the village is west of this fortification. In 1981, John Weymouth did some of the first magnetics in Oklahoma, and one of the sites he visited with Edwards to identify this fort and better give an outline of it. Although these are primitive geophysics compared to what we've done today, they highly outline where the ditch is, where the ramparts probably were by the soil differences, and in the southwest corner of this particular fortification is what appears to be an entryway, which the magnetics give us a lot more information than just the excavations. This ditch, when excavated, was full of bison bone. It was about 3.4 meters wide at the top and extended 1 meter to 1.3 meters deep. So, and it was about 50 meters in diameter across the fort. We're going to go on to the Duncan site and talk about it, and I'll summarize a little bit on this site and the others. Most of the material from this site is similar to late prehistoric village occupation material, except for an increase in southwest trade goods and some southeast goods. In the Duncan site, I mentioned it's not far from Edwards 1. It's in west central Oklahoma on a small tributary of the Wichita River. In fact, the upper part of a small tributary of the Wichita River. In 1981, deep plowing of this field again indicated a circular stain. I don't know if it's very visible on this aerial photograph, but it's dark soil in a complete circle, again, about 50 meters in diameter, just about the same size as the Edwards Fort. We cross-sectioned that trench in 1981, and it is a ditch full of trash from the village. This particular fortification sits at the center of this village with the creek to the west and north. This aerial photo shows much of the site, but some of it extends south of the section road at the bottom of the photograph. The map on the right indicates where a map of excavations that were done in 1984. Unfortunately, we did not go back inside the fortification at that time, but this allowed us, most of the excavations were south of that fortification. This allowed us to see what kind of activities were occurring around in the area. We found plenty of post molds. We could not identify a structure out of them. Some of them are actually associated with shallow pits that were probably roasting pits that still had bison bone on top of charcoal in the shallow pits. There are hearths in the area. There probably were semi-permanent or permanent dwellings, but we were unable to identify what they were from the post-pole matter. The artifact assemblage is basically, again, similar to the late Plains Village stuff that we see in Oklahoma, with the addition of a lot of turquoise, obsidian, and southwestern pottery and various other things. So we had that in 1984. In 2015, we have the opportunity to do geophysics on this site. We used a gradiometer in this case to do magnetic surveys of the site, and it provides some of the best magnetics I've seen from any of the forts that we're going to see. This apple shape on the top right is the magnetic signature of the ditch at Duncan site. Again, it's a roughly 50 meters in diameter. You'll note that our 1981 excavation trench actually cross-sectioned an outer ditch that forms a protective baffle to an entryway. The importance of this magnetic data is it provides us with 3 entryways into this fort. One on the north side where the stem of the apple would come out. There's an opening to directly coming north to south in there. Then you go east down, following along that line, all the way around to the east side, and a major entrance on the east side protected by that outer ditch. And the third entrance is directly on the south side, directly south of pretty much south of the north entryway. And this is a third entryway that's very interesting. It's hard, it may be hard to see, but on both sides on the outside of this entryway, the gradiometer picked up a dark stain that extends south from the entryway. We think this is a stockade trenches that stockade lined the sides of the entryway, protecting the entryway into this fort from direct access or easily defended access into the village. So all 3 of these entryways are important in terms of how they were protecting forts, what they were doing, and how they were constructing it. Again, none of these sites have any indication of European contact. They are pre-contact. They date in the 1500 time period, 1450 to 1600 AD. So this was a big surprise in terms of the magnetics in that deep and that continually plowed field, but it shows the amount of material that can be obtained from geophysical investigations at archaeological sites of these big features that are hard to get with excavations that have such large features. Well, we'll go on from here. So we have 2 sites, similar size fortifications. We didn't see this outside ditch at the other one. I'll note that some of the brighter image on the image on the top right, at the bottom of that image is some white on the inside. That may be back dirt from the for the ramparts of the fort. We don't know. It's not very clear. On the one that we had for Edwards, you could see the ramparts back dirt, even in the plowed field. And I've seen that at other sites that I'll point out if I can remember when we get to them. This is what we think, a drawing of what we think the Wichita Fort at the Duncan site might have looked like. Obviously some artistic design in here, but the stockaded entryway on the south, directly north is that kind of 3-way entryway coming from the west. You come into the north entryway, then you go east, and then you come around to the east entryway. We don't know what was inside this fort at all. We don't know where the ramparts were, but I'd suggest that the stockade may have been on top of the ramparts on the inside of the ditch, based on longest and other fortifications. So our third site in the Texas Panhandle is the Bridwell site. This fort is not plowed, and it consists of a rampart about 50 meters in diameter, the same size as Duncan and Edwards one. And it has a earthen mound about 60 centimeters high. We don't know anything about the ditch. As far as I know, there's been no excavations on this site. The importance of this site is without the plowing, it should be able to identify whether the stockade was built on top of this rampart, if we do if excavations are done at this site, and how the stockade may have been built on top of that. or if it was built inside or outside of the earthen ramparts. We need further work on. I want to mention one other early site, possible early site in the Texas Panhandle, and on the little map in the corner there, 41 HC 241 is an Antelope Creek site up near the Canadian River on Antelope Creek, and it has an earthen pebble embankment noted by Chris Lintz and Osborne. This site has not been investigated other than to document the village and identify the pebble earthen embankment, which was mentioned by Moorhead back in early studies in the Texas Panhandle. If this is a fortification, it is much smaller than these other two that we've looked at in Western Oklahoma, which 17 meters by 13 meters is less than half the size. However, an Antelope Creek site probably dates much earlier or somewhat earlier than what we were talking about, those two Western Oklahoma sites. This may be an early version, and with further investigation, it may fit into the identification of fortifications at Wichita villages. Okay, back to our map. We're going to look at the 18th century Wichita sites that we know of. There are 4 of them. There's one in southeast Kansas on the Verdigris River. There's 2 up on the Arkansas River near the Kansas border. And note the Lower Walnut Complex up just north of those sites. I'll mention a site there that may be significant later on. And then the longest site is JF1 down there on the Red River. The MU-17 site is the Spanish Fort site. We don't know if there was a fortification of that village because it hasn't been investigated and there's been no identification of one. But based on like the pair of villages up on the Arkansas River, both have fortifications, although they're only a mile and a half apart. These are just across the river from each other. The villagers in the Texas village could have gone to the fort on the longest side, or they could have built their own. I just have a big question mark on that. We will we'll go through these 17th century ones, 1700 ones, and then we'll mention a little bit more about the historic ones, including longest. I wanted to mention that the forts on the Arkansas River with historic records, it suggests that they moved down to the longest and Spanish fort sites sometime in the 1750s, probably 1755 or later. It was 1757 when they attacked San Saba Mission. Many of those sites in Texas are date to after 1750 and into the 1800s. Okay, our southeast Kansas site, Neodesha Fort. This site is no longer, basically you cannot see the fortification. There's a lot of different disturbances in it, but we have descriptions of it that date back into the 1800s. And in 1931, there was a good description of it before the main fort area was destroyed or disturbed. It is different from the other sites we're going to look at, but it's possible that there is a fortification with a U shape that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. This has 2 U shapes with a defensive line in the middle. This is larger than any of the other investigated dimensions. It's also a site that could be one of 2 Wichita villages on the Verdigris that Dustanay visited, a Frenchman visited in 1719. We don't know that. And the other thing is that Dustanay did not mention fortifications, although his descriptions of the village are very brief anyway. But this archaeologically needs to be further investigated to see if we can define it. We don't even know from the descriptions. There might be 2 embankments and ditches. We don't know where the ditches are in relation to the embankments and various other aspects of this archaeological site. But it has the material that dates with European goods, French trade goods showing up in the early 1700s. So it matches what could have been one of the villages that Dustanay may have visited. I want to also mention in the Lower Walnut area on that southern part of south central Kansas, there has recently been an aerial photography investigation of the large villages that extended across the Arkansas and Walnut River, junction area. And there is a circular stain that may indicate a 50-meter in diameter semicircular or circular fortification. I have to say, though, that that site would date earlier also, probably before 1500 or in the early 1500s. And there's been no investigation yet archeologically of what that aerial photo is, those aerial photos are showing. Many of these, they're small, generally smaller, 50 meters in diameter or smaller. In other parts of Kansas that may be fortifications, but are considered other kind of structures that may predate the forts that appear in southern sites in Oklahoma and Texas. We just don't know about what's called council circles in Kansas enough to decide if they're part of defensive structures or other kind of structures. I want to move to the Bryson-Paddock site. This is one of the villages on the Arkansas River. It's on a high bluff above the Arkansas. On the left side of this photo is this tree line is the bluff edge, which drops about 70 feet down to the Arkansas River bottoms. The foreground of this picture is most of it is the village site known as the Bryson-Paddock Village. This was first investigated in 1926, which is one of the earliest excavations we have in Oklahoma. They excavated trash mounds, which are found at most Wichita sites in the 1800s. These are mounds where trash deposits build up, and in the 1926 work was, although archaeological in nature, it was, as you might imagine, designed to get museum artifacts from the site. And there were 11 trash mounds excavated completely. Some of these ranged from 25 to 40 feet in diameter. Interestingly enough, the archaeologists investigating this used quarter-inch mesh screen. It's the first time I think can be documented in this area that a quarter-inch screen was used to find artifacts and recover. Although the archaeological method is not didn't provide much information. These are best guess estimates on these mounds labeled M1 through 11, where they were based on descriptions. Again, in 1974-75, this site was investigated when a lake was put in on the Arkansas River. The site is well above the lake, and it remains in private ownership now. In 2003, we began further investigations at this site with 2 property owners that allowed us to do work. A large over 40-foot diameter round structure was excavated in 1975, along with another semi-subterranean structure and some many pits, hearths, and stuff like that. Our investigations, 2003 to 2014, we wanted to detail what's in different parts of the site. We were thinking about fortifications, but at the time, Bryson-Paddock was not considered to be a fortified village. The village Deer Creek site south of this was known to be fortified, and I'll get to that in a minute. When we started investigating this, the features intact. There's about half of this site has never been plowed, which is unusual in most sites in Oklahoma and many other places. But we were able to investigate and determine the intact features as a pitch, hearts, storage pits, and even mounds still remain. They weren't all excavated in 1926. But with further work, I wanted to mention, we do have artifacts that indicate French trade with this site, and there are some early historic records that are very brief that mention French trade and actually mention 2 villages on the Arkansas that had forts. That's the extent of the fortification information on those sites. But no fort had ever been found at Bryson-Paddock on the previous work. The important thing is we get the mix of European goods, triangular unnotched arrow points, Fresnos, ceramic pipes, a few red pipestone pipes, metal points, tinklers, kettles, gun parts, that kind of thing show up in all through the deposits at this site. With the Wichita, we're trading with the French, primarily bison hides and meat, but a variety of other things. And our best dates for this site are 1720s to 1750s. And as I mentioned, this site and Deer Creek were abandoned by about 1755. Okay, when we were working at Deer Creek in the unplowed pasture, there's this nice feature, this little ditch that comes straight down the hill from in the pasture and makes a right turn at the bottom of the screen. Well, there is no reason it should have made a right turn at the bottom of the screen, so we suspected we had a fortification ditch here, and we got help from Texas. Jim Bruseth and Bill Pearson from the Texas Historical Commission in 2005 came up with the magnetometer system, which can cover a large area. Considering this site's over 35 acres in size, that's very helpful for us. They ran several large areas of this site for magnetic surveys. Geophysics ran a small section of the site for magnetics and electrical resistivity. And in 2008, we acquired a gradiometer ourselves at the Archeological Survey and did additional surveys. This is a map of Bryson-Paddock with all the magnetics shown in it. As you can see, we did, with the help of especially the Texas magnetometer, we did quite large portions of it. The upper left corner is a plowed field, and the lower left corner is a plowed field. The others on the right are the unplowed portions of Bryson-Paddock. Most of the excavations in 74 and 75, when the lake came in, are there on the lower right in black, and the mounds are still on here. We use this to try to identify the fort and to get us information on the fort. This is the lower right corner. I'm going to show you the northwest part of that. This is a color enhanced view. On the right side of this, the left side of this, you can see the ditch that we could see in the field. That's the big wide ditch there. These blue line, the dark blue things, those are back dirt from ditches. There are actually 3 other ditches to the east, to the right of that large ditch in this magnetic thing. And in the middle, near the bottom there, we can see an excavation into a trash mound that was done in 1975, and then other trash mounds nearby that still are extant. I won't go into that. I got to enlarge this image because we did work in this area. We trenched all 4 of these ditches to confirm them with excavations, and they are all confirmed. You notice that the one on the left is much larger than the other 3, the outer 3. And there's a break in the outer one marked by what I have an entryway there. And in the lower left corner of this slide is the original magnetic surveys with the entryway marked. You can see the ditches are labeled there and they end where it says entryway. We tested this in 2014, and on the lower right, you can see the break in the ditch and that the ditches are offset slightly so that they could put up probably a protective fence or something, although we did not find the post holes for such a fence to limit structure. Our other idea is that they may not have had access at different points on the inner ditches. So the outer ditch is access where I've got the arrow, but you had to go north or south to get it to into the next one and such and such. And the inner ditch is not broken in this area. So with access to the inside, complete inside of the fort would have been through a different area of the site for sure. So here's another view of the plowed field. Even in the plowed field, the ditches show up real good. I haven't marked them on here, but these little white squares are excavation units. On the left, lower left, is our 2008 magnetometer, and there are 4 ditches on that side also. So we have 4 ditches at this particular site, with the largest as the inside one. This is a profile of one of the outer ditch, the outermost ditches, and then the profile on the upper screen is a profile of another part of that same ditch in a different section. We cored and did magnetics along this. It extends at least 65 meters, and as you'll see, it may go all the way around the site. The fort may complete a circle around the site. They are trash filled and with washed in soil at different places. There is one big difference. In the inside wide ditch, we found features such as a large post hole on the left and numerous other post holes. Here's one profiled in the picture at the right. Also, this ditch has a straighter drop to the bottom on the outsides and is flat floored instead of a little bit of dip like a moat type ditch. These again are filled somewhat with trash. We also found burned wood and burned soil near and at the bottom of the ditch. This is a charred piece of oak, which is unburned at the center, but was preserved. And when we excavated a large section out of the plowed field, we found a ditch going north, southeast and northwest, and another ditch coming off of it that formed a big circle at its end. The upper part on that map on the left is what we consider a subterranean house. It's the same depth of the ditch, comes off the ditch. It has 4 center posts and a hearth. There's a profile of part of the hearth, which was ash filled in the floor, and you can see post mold scattered around. Basically, we found a subterranean structure ditch, is what we think, with what we're calling a house, the subterranean house off of it. The house-like structure off this ditch has never been recorded historically, and we don't, and this is the first archaeological recording of it, so we don't know what that is. This structure ditch is mentioned at Longest Site, and they describe, I've got it down the bottom here, inside there are 4 subterranean apartments occupying its circumference, the circumference of the fort at Longest, into which all the people who cannot help with the defense of the said settlement retreat in time of invasion. This is what we discovered at Bryson-Paddock, and we've tested a number of different areas along this and all the different fortifications. And you'll notice on this map that at the bottom right, there's a slight break in it, and another ditch keeps going down into the pasture from there. So we have good confirmation of the first unusual structure at a ditch that was similar to a description of the fort at Longest. So basically, for 18th century forts, we've got Longest for our best descriptions. You can see we've excavated quite extensively in the fort area and the entryway. We think there were an entryway where this ditch comes out, where this dry ditch comes out of the fort. So there are at least 2 entryways here, at least 4 ditches that we can determine, with the subterranean ditch in yellow on this map. And stockades were probably used. On the magnetics, we can tell that most of the dirt for ramparts were thrown to the inside of ditches. The gates, as I mentioned, may offset each other and may form kind of a labyrinth to get to the middle of the site, increasing defense for this fort. There's one caveat to that. Ditches appear to have been abandoned during the occupation of the village, and we have pits in hearths that overlap filled in ditches. So it's unclear if all the moats and ditches were, all the moats or moat type ditches were used at one time. We have not found a trash pit that intersects the inner ditch, so it may have been occupied in use for the entire time of the fortification. All right, we've got a couple more that we need to go through real quick. The Deer Creek site is predominantly unplowed. This is a 1938 on the right aerial photo, and you can see that kind of U-shaped or horseshoe-shaped feature in the photograph. It was investigated in 1976 with detailed mapping, and there was some magnetic survey of it, which I'll get to in a minute. This ditch is about 76 meters in diameter and 0.3 to 1.2 meters deep, as best we can tell, but it was not excavated. And it may have had ramparts on the inside again of the outer ditches and in the inner ditch. The entryways at this site, on the right, the 1981 magnetics indicate an entryway, which is the green area is the magnetics on the left, and the entryways pointed out there. The U-shape or horseshoe shape faces north towards the Deer Creek, and there's a spring right north of there, right on Deer Creek, that ditch may have led to and might have been protected for access to water. And we know there's at least one moat type ditch on the west side, according to the mapping. We were able to go back to, in 2014 through 17 at different times, to do more magnetics. We had to clear the site. It was heavily forested by this time. And we use mulching of the trees to to take the timber off without destroying the undisturbed site. So we have a football size area through the middle of this fort. The magnetic of that are on there. You can see on the right, there's a ditch, a big ditch on the right, another section of it on the left where it comes around, and then mounds, trash mounds, and a bell-shaped pit were identified with it and confirmed with excavations. We profiled through half of the structure ditch, which is what we thought that big ditch was, and we did find post molds in the bottom of it, which suggests that it's similar to Bryson-Paddock. This fortification, interestingly, doesn't appear to have the complexity, at least not the outer moat type ditches that we saw at Bryson-Paddock, but at least was fortified. And we have limited work on this site. This is the only work that's been done, ever been done on the Deer Creek site. And finally, we go back to the longest site. We went back in 2012 to do magnetics on it since we were having success with various forts. On the left, on the pictures on the right, on the left corner one, there's the magnetics of it with the ditches pointed out. And on the right, I've drawn in the ditches. There are 3 ditches at longest. The one that was tested in 1967 is the green one on the upper right, kind of the northeast corner of the fortification ditch. The middle yellow ditch, when we excavated across it, I think it's fairly shallow. I think it's used for soils to increase the rampart size on the outer moat ditch. In the inner ditch, the white in this drawing is a subterranean structure ditch, which we confirmed with excavations. On the bottom of that magnetic picture, you'll see the bottom of the fort ditches and a detail of the different sites, the different ditches that were profiled. Moat, the middle ditch, and the subterranean structure ditch. And on the right is the break. You can really see an entryway in this remote sensing on this zone. And we were unable to test it at that time. This ditch is about a meter deep. The moat ditch is about 3 meters, 3.5 meters wide. The structure ditch is about 7 meters wide. It's much bigger than, and that would be the subterranean apartments that they were describing in the Spanish descriptions and French descriptions of village in the 1760s. You can see our excavations. There's a post hole profile on the bottom of this, but up on where the signboard is a step. This is at the edge of the moat of the structure ditch. And there's a step in there, and some of the descriptions of some of the later fortifications describe a step inside the fortifications that defenders could stand on and look out through the roof structure. Fill on this structure is burning near the bottom with probably burned grass roofing structure, and fill of this, it's filled up relatively rapidly. The longest site is very sandy soil, and it filled very rapidly with silt and sand and few artifacts, trash in the structure ditch. So to sum up, we've got a little bit of information on a lot of forts. The ones we've got date from the longest site in 1760s to early 1800s, and go back to 1450 or 1500 in Western Oklahoma and Northwest Texas, Panhandle areas. And they extended into at least southern Kansas. The historic documentation is extremely limited. The Waco site that I have listed down here, there are historic reports, very brief reports of circular fortifications at Waco sites and possibly some other Wichita sites. And there's an 1830 description of a Cherokee attack on a Waco village that surprised the Waco, and they retreated into a subterranean, in this case, linear structure. They called it a lodge. And they were able to fire out through the roof of that lodge from a step inside, and eventually help arrived, and the Cherokee left the scene. But they say the villagers that survived the attack survived because of that lodge. So structures were changing by 1830. There might have been still some circular fortifications. Linear subterranean structures may have been a defense at some villages. By the 1850s, no villages that we know of have descriptions of historic or archaeological sites have fortifications by 1850s. That's a brief and rapid summary of Wichita forts. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Drass. Before I let you go, I do have 2 questions.
Sure.
For those fortification sites that lack European trade goods, how are you dating those sites?
We radiocarbon dated them.
Okay,
And
so,
the
all right.
radiocarbon dates are not too bad in that 1450 to 1600 time period. The ones for the, you know, we have radiocarbon problems for like longest in Deer Creek and Bryson-Paddock, but even those sites, the most prominent probable dates are in the 1700s. The artifacts at the where we have European artifacts fit the descriptions for 1700, you know, early 1700s to 1800s at longest. But, you know. So,
All right, great. And for those of us who may not be familiar with geophysics and remote sensing, with the magnetic surveys, what is it about those features, like the ditches, that are producing those anomalies? Does it have something to do with the soil moisture?
To a degree, what happened with magnetics anyway, all soil has some iron in it usually, and the magnetics are set to north over time in the soils naturally. Anything that disturbs it, any digging, anything that burns it, fires, that heat up, changes the magnetics. And when those changes of magnetics occur, when you disturb and change up that soil, it shows up magnetically. As you saw, a best example would be from the Duncan site where the ditch showed up so well. It takes, expertise to sometimes manipulate and get this data to show it. It's because it's a small scale of change in magnetics. Now, electrical resistivity obviously does different things. Subsurface radar is different. They will all, to a degree, identify features from various aspects, but the magnetics, disturbances, pits, hearths, burned houses, ditches, all those things show up magnetically different from the surrounding soil that's not disturbed originally, especially if you're digging into the subsoils too. So, and most of these do. So all of this, even all the sites like Longest and parts of Bryson-Paddock and Duncan and Edwards have been plowed for 100 years or more. So we don't know the ramparts, but even with the magnetics, they threw the dirt to the inside. That changed the magnetics in that area. And so even when they're plowed, they're showing that different magnetics where the ramparts where the back dirt, which formed the ramparts, used to be. And the ditch is, by the same token, it's filled with, often the ditches are filled with trash, and that changes various aspects, electrical resistivity, the magnetics and everything. And they hold more moisture, and because of that. So all those factors help, but in terms of magnetics, it's the disturbance really that changes the native soils, changes that feature from the native soil magnetics.
All right, well, once again, thank you very much. And if any of our viewers have a question for Dr. Drass, feel free to insert your question in the comment section below. Okay. And on that note, that concludes our presentation. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.